In this day and age, it is viewed as something of a heresy to question the official history of an event as given to us by the corporate media. As I record this late in the evening on October 2nd, just a day after the events in Las Vegas of October 1st, it is obviously too soon to make definitive pronouncements about what took place. However, I would argue that it is imperative to examine the evidence in all of the recent shocking incidents of the past few years with a critical mind, because the control over history, as George Orwell makes very clear in his famous book 1984, is a powerful tool. And there is abundant evidence that the narrative that we are given of historical events has been manipulated and continues to be manipulated to this day. It stands to reason that if what we are told to believe about historical events, which are now removed from the present by the intervention of decades, and which are already receding into the more distant past, can be manipulated, then what we are told to believe about much more recent historical events may be manipulated as well. That said, we're already being told exactly what to believe about the events in Las Vegas that took place on October 1st. This morning, as I listened to the news, National Public Radio confidently proclaimed that the shooting had been carried out by a lone wolf shooter who has been positively identified and who had acted on his own. Later in the day, we learned that he had upwards of 20 firearms in his room on the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Hotel, and that he had at least 2 fully automatic machine guns mounted on tripods. We were also told that 59 concertgoers were killed and over 520 were wounded, in addition to those who died. That means an enormous amount of ammunition must have been expended during the shooting. While it's too early to make any definitive pronouncements, there are some extremely suspicious aspects to this story, not least of which being the need for a single shooter to have upwards of 20 firearms and the logistics involved in transporting that much weaponry and ammunition to the hotel, let alone up to the 32nd floor room without attracting any attention and while acting entirely alone. There's also the question of how that much heavy weaponry was obtained by someone whose own brother says he was not a gun enthusiast without attracting any notice. If he went in and bought that much weaponry. And there's also the question of how all that weaponry and ammunition was fired off so effectively by someone who had no military experience. Additionally, purported video footage of the incident itself does not contain enough audio or visual evidence to support the claims of so many dead and wounded. In the following video clip, you can hear what is evidently the first burst of automatic weapon fire. I, myself, am a former infantry officer with 11 years of active duty in line units of the regular Army in the 82nd Airborne Division and the 4th Infantry Division. I'm a graduate of Ranger School, and I'm someone who's done extensive live fire exercises using automatic weapons, including the venerable M60 machine gun, the M240 Bravo machine gun, the M249 squad automatic weapon, various assault rifles, and this initial extended burst sounds to me like an M60 machine gun, which is typically belt-fed and uses a 2 or 3-man crew. Note that at the end of the burst, there's no hysterical screaming, such as we would expect if numerous persons had been shot and wounded, and there's very little hysteria from the crowd. In fact, throughout the entire video, we hear only a couple cries of pain from one female voice, and that's about it, despite the fact that we hear other extended bursts, including bursts of firing from a different weapon from the one that was firing the initial rounds. Here's another video in which the crowd basically just calmly hunkers down, no hysteria, very few intense screams of pain, no one acting as though they're realizing that their lives are in actual danger, which would probably start dawning on people if that much ammunition was being fired into a crowd. There's nobody running around, and there's some fairly calm voices saying down, down, which is not what we would expect if large caliber bullets were actually causing huge numbers of casualties.
Okay, I promise. We can't go yet. We can't go yet. Austin!
Whatever did in fact take place, it stands to reason that we should critically examine the claims that a single person did this, and even that the person that we're being told was the shooter was the one who did it. It's quite possible that another group could have done this and that they killed the person who's being called the lone shooter and left that person to be blamed. And as heretical as it seems, we should also critically examine the evidence to support the claim that 59 people were killed and over 520 wounded, because the videos shown right here only contain the sound of automatic weapons fire and a response from a crowd that might as well have been hired to act like they think people might act in such a situation. Not very convincing evidence. There's a very good reason to be suspicious of these media grabbing events, because as some researchers have started pointing out over the last several years, there is evidence that at least some of these media grabbing events are being staged. Researcher Ulla Dammegard has been at the forefront of some of this research, and he was recently interviewed by Greg Carlwood of the Higher Side Chats this August 2017, just a few days before the events of Charlottesville. And during that interview, Ulla noted that some of these events appear to have been staged in advance using a troupe of actors complete with high-resolution photographs, which seem to match up with the grainy video footage that's taken during the events, but which may contain clear anomalies and differences. This portion of the interview that we're going to listen to was recorded before the events at Charlottesville in August of this year, 2017, and the patterns that Ulla describes fit very closely with the footage that we later saw from the Charlottesville incident. Here's a high-resolution image of people flying into the air, supposedly snapped when the gray Dodge Charger rammed into a crowd. But notice how incredibly good this photo is. We can see droplets of water and even a pair of glasses flying into the air. Now, watch this footage, this grainy footage, and you might ask yourself exactly where that camera person was who snapped the previous incredibly good photograph. You might also ask yourself where some of the people that you see in the high-res photo are in the video. Notice how this individual just gets up after apparently being hit. You see that in a couple of individuals. Now ask yourself how this same individual could be in these two different positions, one in the high-res image and one in this screenshot that comes from the more grainy video footage. In the video screenshot, here he is rolling off the right fender of this Toyota truck here. But in the high-res photo that was published in the New York Times, still available on their website, he is clearly getting ready to hit the ground well to the left of that same Toyota truck. He's definitely wearing the same clothing and accessories, but these cannot possibly be from the same acrobatic performance. They're two different takes. And here is some video footage from the incident in Orlando from 2016, in which we were told that 50 people were killed by another lone nut gunman acting entirely without any assistance. Does this look like any way to evacuate a wounded casualty? I hope he doesn't have a neck injury with the way that they're carrying this guy. But apparently, this whole charade is being directed by a person in a position of authority. That's the tall female wearing a bulletproof vest of the type that we used to call a chicken vest in the military. It's not a full flak vest. Yeah. And she's leading this little procession. It looks like something from a weird play and not an actual mass casualty incident. And now let's listen to Ulla Damagard talking to Greg Carlwood, recorded prior to Charlottesville, and talking about how many times shoes are off in these incidents. And while you listen, just count how many shoes you see flying loose in the air or lying on the ground in the high-res New York Times photo. I recommend kind of starting on the left and going in a clockwise fashion around the photo as he's speaking. And also note how many people you can see with one shoe on and one shoe off. I'll give you a hint. There's one of them lying by the bumper of that truck on the right. There's another one who's flying straight up in the air. His feet are straight up in the air, and he's missing a shoe. So listen to Ulla.
Very proudly. I mean, it's hidden in plain sight.
Right. That's just so interesting. And another thing about Freemasons is I've also heard you talking about shoes in a lot of this footage and some strange inconsistencies around that.
I tell you one thing over the years that I never understood was that why are there always shoes lying around? Why are people always without one or two shoes? And why are they sometimes without like one trouser leg? You will see that repeatedly. And I found one time, just by more or less accident, I stumbled over on a Freemasonic website, more or less Freemasons for Dummies, where it describes the way they carry out their rituals. And one of the things that the new members have to do is they have to roll up one of their trouser legs and then take off one shoe. And that one shoe shows that this individual, also the trouser leg, this individual is doing it voluntarily. If there are two shoes missing, then that shows grace to the location or worship of the location of the sacrifice being carried out and so on. And here, once I started seeing that, I felt, oh my God, that is it. Because this is one of the way they send these signals out to other Freemasons all over the world saying, our operation, we're in it, we're in control.
And now let's go back to that Orlando incident, and we'll watch that little mass casualty drill again. We'll see that person being carried out. Also no shoes. Of course, as Ulla explains, one shoe missing is part of Masonic symbol and ritual, but it's also a feature in numerous ancient myths, including the story of Jason in ancient Greece, of Jason and the Argonauts, and also the story of Da Mo, or Bodhidharma, in China. It's a pattern that we find throughout myths. It's very clear from my research that all of the world's ancient myths are in fact closely connected, and they're using the same system of celestial metaphor, which connects the mythology of ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon, ancient Greece, myths around the world. In fact, all the myths and sacred stories around the world are connected by this system, including the stories in the Bible, the stories of ancient India, Northern Europe, Africa, Australia, the Americas, the Pacific, other parts of Asia. And that just shows that what we've been told of ancient history is completely incorrect. And yet, the conventional narrative continues to be taught, and it continues to be heresy to question the conventional narrative of ancient history. Here's a clip from a documentary released decades ago, narrated by Charlton Heston, featuring the groundbreaking research of John Anthony West and Professor Robert Schoch, who together found conclusive evidence in the Sphinx of Giza, which shows that our narrative of ancient history is completely wrong. Notice in this clip how the defenders of the conventional historical narrative respond to the unorthodox views and evidence presented by John Anthony West and Professor Robert Schoch.
There is many theories like this has been said about the Sphinx, but all of it gone with the wind, because we Egyptologists have a solid evidence to state that the Sphinx is dated to the time of Khafren, the builder of the second pyramid at the Giza Plateau.
West and Schoch were undaunted by the ridicule. They knew their theory was based on solid evidence. Virtually all of the temples and tombs on the Giza Plateau have been weathered by wind and sand. So why would the Sphinx be the only monument weathered by water? To a geologist, erosion tells the story of a rock's history. The limestone bedrock in Giza is like a layer cake composed of both hard and soft layers. The wind-driven sand scours out the softer layers, leaving the harder layers intact. An example of this is found here in the tomb of Debian, which is carved out of the exact same rock as the Sphinx. Once a smooth wall, it's been exposed to desert conditions for over 4,000 years. On the other hand, rain weathering has an entirely different look. Rocks which have been weathered by rain have a round, undulating profile. This is very different in appearance from the hard, sharp profile caused by wind weathering.
This is classic textbook example of what happens to a limestone wall when you have rains beating down on it for thousands of years.
It's only found in one area on the Giza Plateau, here, on the Sphinx and on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. These man-made vertical walls were carved from the same layer of bedrock, a mere 300 yards apart. According to Egyptologists, they were carved at the same time. But if that's so, shouldn't they exhibit the same pattern of erosion? Dr. Lehner has an entirely different explanation.
Well, Dr. Schoch is saying we have the same layer, and here on the Sphinx it's weathered, and here on this Old Kingdom tomb it's not, carved out of the same layer. And we are saying, and I bow to Dr. Gorey on this as a geologist, no, those are two different layers. The weather at different rates. It all comes down to that, basically, aside from the massive problem that Dr. Schoch has with no cultural context.
In spite of the overwhelming and irrefutable evidence, John Anthony West and Robert Schoch were viciously attacked in academic circles, and they were mercilessly ridiculed. I would argue, along with George Orwell, that control of history is a powerful weapon. If what we've been instructed to believe about the ancient past has been manipulated, then what makes us think that what we're being told to believe about the more recent past might not also be manipulated in some instances? And now notice the location of the most recent shocking and traumatic event, the events of just this weekend, October 1st. This is an aerial image that was shown in the New York Times. Look where the concert goers were. They are positioned right in front of the Luxor Pyramid with a Sphinx replica. Isn't that ironic? I would advise every man and woman to start thinking critically and examining the evidence for yourself when it comes to what you are being told to believe about history, whether ancient or recent. And those who are manipulating the people and their perceptions by subverting the truth and promoting lies in order to take for themselves what the gods have given to all men and women are acting as traitors to humanity itself, and ultimately to heaven and to the gods as well.